Rejoice, episode 146, Seeing Stars. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. Let's take up where we left off in last week's complex text. If you remember, Stephen was bending over a rock on Sandymount Strand, writing lines from a poem that's coming to him. And he's writing on a piece of paper torn from the bottom of Mr. Deasy's foot-and-mouth letter, because he's forgotten to gather enough of the free slips left out by the National Library in Dublin. Long, narrow slips of good paper, by the way, for their readers to make notes while they're reading in the library. Here's the entire passage of Ulysses that I set out to analyze last week and didn't get through. Here we go. His shadow lay over the rocks as he bent, ending. Why not endless till the farthest star? Darkly they are there behind this light, darkness shining in the brightness. Delta of Cassiopeia, worlds. Me sits there with his ogre's rod of ash in borrowed sandals, by day beside a livid sea, unbeheld, in violet night walking beneath a rain of uncouth stars. I throw this ended shadow from me, man-shape ineluctable, call it back. Endless, would it be mine, form of my form? Who watches me here? Who ever anywhere will read these written words, signs on a white field? Somewhere to someone? In your flutiest voice? End of passage, and I only got as far as Cassiopeia, who comes back a few times, by the way. And once, very touchingly, we have a look at the constellation. So, let me take up sentence by sentence what follows, and as you recognize by now, that passage had mixtures in it of Stephen's thoughts and Joyce's narration. Here we go. Me sits there with his ogre's rod of ash in borrowed sandals, by day beside a livid sea, unbeheld, in violet night walking beneath a rain of uncouth stars. Hoo-hoo! I've read it flatly, deliberately, by the way. Now, we know from past experience that when you're reading Ulysses, you're also reading a ton of other writers. We're only in chapter 3. We're still, as I say, on Sandymount Strand. A matter of some impatience here and there, as I've gathered from your communications. And we have already encountered a ton of other writers. Of these, the most prominent so far, I'd guess, have been Shakespeare and William Blake. Throw in Thomas Aquinas and Plato and Aristotle. Didn't I do a bonus edition on the writers so far? Yes, I did. I'm pretty certain it was episode 96A. I mean, the list is already long. Swinburne, Nietzsche, the Scottish poet Robert Burns, Oscar Wilde, Matthew Arnold, William Butler Yeats, Sir Isaac Newton, the Bible, Dante, Virgil. Toss in T.S. Eliot too, and of course, there's always the mighty river beneath the surface of planet Ulysses, Homer himself. Now this week, whatever his own protestations, that's Joyce, I mean, that he wasn't influenced by him, I'm going to throw Sigmund Freud on the heap of these writers who inspired Joyce, and on whom he drew, never plagiarizing, mind you. And maybe add Carl Gustav Jung, because this is an important sentence. Me sits there with his ogre's rod of ash, in borrowed sandals, by day beside a livid sea, unbeheld, in violet night, walking beneath a rain of uncouth stars. It's Stephen's view of himself. It's Stephen looking at himself, taking a look at himself. And over throughout Ulysses, we will find Stephen in the act of self-observation. There's an interesting conflict that goes on. He's both observing himself and not observing himself fully enough. Actually, the self-help books and the psychology manuals would have a field day with Stephen. And at a lower intellectual later on in the book, as you'll see, but much more humanly in a way, if there is such a word as humanly, but you know what I mean. Mr. Bloom, Leopold Bloom, does it too. He looks at himself. In fact, he's looking at himself all the time. Well, here, though, at this moment, it takes the form with Stephen of an attempt at objectivity, as he dives into the subjective work of creating a poem. The fact that he's actually borrowing from another poet to write the poem is neither here nor there, but we will come to that in due course. Me sits there. Here I am, he's saying. Remember, he has early reflected that if he sat there naked, who would see him? So he's already conscious of being visible. In this chapter, that's all about visibility and the philosophy of visibility. And a few sentences from now, we'll meet the apostle of that philosophy of visibility. Me sits there with his ogre's rod of ash. He's still carrying his walking cane, an ash plant of the kind that cattle drovers use. Remember, he took it with him when he left the Martello Tower in Chapter 1. And now he chooses to see this stick, because he's been thinking about the constellation of stars known as Cassiopeia. He chooses to see it as the little wooden stick the Roman augurs used. That's A-U-G-U-R, by the way. The augur or augury was a key part of Roman culture, and some people say augury, but the augury is really what the augur produced, the forecast that he produced. The augur was a soothsayer of sorts, a man of great distinction, an advisor to the emperor, and he foretold the future principally by observing the flights of birds by day and the stars by night. And oddly enough, growing up in Ireland, I more than once heard people say that there were folks, farmers mostly, who could forecast the weather by the flights of birds. And it's certainly true, in my experience, that swallows flying low signify oncoming rain. I'm pretty sure, too, that Stephen Dedalus himself, I'll have to check this, doesn't he, in a portrait of the artist, doesn't he look at the sky and wonder whether it can tell him his future? And that, by the way, is a very crude shorthand for what the augur did. The augur told what lies ahead by checking the day and night skies. And now you see how it's all hanging together in this section of the chapter. Stephen has been observing the gypsy woman on the strand, and he's been imagining her trekking westward, and he's been working the stars into the language of the poem he's writing. And keep an eye on that ash plant, that walking stick, because the stick was the augur's tool. And there's a tool, a carpenter's tool, called an auger, A-U-G-E-R, for boring into things. And tool is an Irish slang euphemism for penis. And remember, Stephen has been having the beginnings of a sexual fantasy about the gypsy woman. And I can tell you, we'll meet that ash stick again down through the years of Ulysses. I'm enormously interested in this short passage because of how typical it is in terms of how many references Joyce has embedded. The next 3 words are a perfect example. In borrowed sandals, we'll also, and repeatedly, come across references to Stephen's poverty throughout the novel, and you may recall that in Chapter 1, the buck, Mulligan, taunts him about the second-hand pants Stephen wears, and offers to hand down other clothes to him. Well, a few paragraphs from now, a few weeks from now, we'll discover that Stephen's boots are what he calls a buck's cast-offs, so he's wearing borrowed boots from Mulligan. We'll come to that. But right here, now, there's another reference to Stephen's wearing of hand-me-down footwear, and it's Shakespearean, and we've already touched on it a few weeks ago. Do you remember how Stephen thinks of the hat that he's wearing as his Hamlet hat? Well, here's the quote that matters. It's from Ophelia's song in Hamlet, the song she sings shortly before she drowns herself, just before Gertrude the Queen sees her and describes her as incapable of her own distress. I love that line, incapable of her own distress. Ophelia's wandering through the castle at Elsinore singing. Something has deranged her more than usual. There are interpretations, not very subtle, that Hamlet either seduced her or raped her, and had promised to marry her, but instead dumped her. And the song on this point is more or less explicit. The song goes, "Quoth she, before you tumbled me, you promised me to wed." But the part we're concerned with here is this first verse, and the first verse of the song is, "How should I your true love know from another one? By his cockle hat and staff, and his sandal shoon." So, let's go back over it. Me sits there with his ogre's rod of ash in borrowed sandals, by day beside a livid sea, unbeheld, in var at night, walking beneath a rain of uncouth stars. So, next phrase, or phase, if you will, by day beside a livid sea, unbeheld, in var at night, walking beneath a rain of uncouth stars. What is this about? Well, Stephen is divining like an augur, by day and by night. Livid describes the flat grey of the sea that he's looking out upon, and it's also like Anna Livia Pluribella from Finnegan's Wake. And it's a word that Joyce likes. He uses it 5 times in Ulysses, but, next phrase, he uses the word violet 19 times to describe night and other things, underwear, garters, gloves, things associated with women. What's going on? Well, we should actually be asking what's about to go on. shall we call it, a deed of the night, usually carried out beneath the stars, making them uncouth. That's why he uses the word unbeheld. He doesn't want anyone to see him, right now, and especially in a few minutes' time. And now, in the midst of composing his poem about vampires, he's becoming extremely self-aware and self-observational. No wonder Jung wanted to analyze Joyce. And before I go, can I just alert you to a couple of other references that play in here almost unconsciously? In the Odyssey, Telemachus, the son of Odysseus, meets a blind seer. I almost said Stephen. Telemachus meets a blind seer called Tiresias. Now, remember that this chapter is all about seeing, and Stephen is having difficulty without his glasses, and he's short-sighted anyway, and he's leaning on a rock. Well, there's a poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson called Tiresias, and it has lots of references to skies and stars and heavens, etc. And it also has this line, "The noonday crag made the hand burn." And Stephen is actually resting his hands on a stone as he's trying to write there. You might say, go Joyce. More next week. Rejoice, episode 147, Shovel Hats and Shadows. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. Having fun yet? So far, Chapter 3 of Ulysses is the most complex to unravel. And remember, I'm not getting into debates on the deeper subtexts, many of which I would love to argue, but there simply isn't time to take on all the theses and dissertations that have been uncoiled from Ulysses. So I'm contenting myself with the more immediate references, the ones that lie strewn about the surface, so to speak, or hidden in nearby jars and closets, carefully tucked away by Joyce, who wanted us to search for them. Were I to go flat out for out-and-out deconstructions on every literary and psychological level, every presumed literary and psychological level, I'd need another 70 years, and thereby arises a question. How conscious was Joyce of everything he did? How conscious was Shakespeare in his, 37 known plays, and perhaps a few extras? Is there a better example for use in a debate about what a writer does consciously and unconsciously? Is there a better example than Ulysses? Yes, you can cry Finnegan's Wake and all of Shakespeare. Anyway, that said, where are we? I left you last week under uncouth stars on a violet night and also beside a livid daytime sea, and we now enter a passage of Stephen's thoughts again as he observes himself on Sandymount Strand. Here we go. I throw this ended shadow from me, man-shape ineluctable, call it back. Endless would it be mine, form of my form. Who watches me here? Who ever anywhere will read these written words? Signs on a white field. Somewhere to someone in your flutiest voice. The good Bishop of Cloyne took the veil of the temple out of his shovel hat, veil of space, with coloured emblems hatched on its field. End of quote. Yes, well, deep breath. Look at it. Here we go. Imagine the actual scene on the beach. Stephen has been leaning over a rock, making a poem on scraps of paper, using the rock as his writing table. He stands, sees his shadow elongate in the sunshine, unmistakably a man's shadow to judge from the shape, and when he dips again to write on or rest on the rock, he naturally truncates the shadow. I throw this ended shadow from me, man-shape ineluctable, call it back. So he's playing with his own shadow, and he's observing its form in a chapter all about form. Listen, next sentence. Endless would it be mine, form of my form? And of course it would. It's the form of his shadow, which is the shape of his body. And first of all, there's a certain amount of play here with the words ended and endless, because remember, he's been tinkering with the word endless for his vampire poem. Then he gets back into Aristotle. Didn't we do De Anima before? I think so. Yes, we touch on it in chapter 2 and have a lot about it then at the beginning of this chapter. Anyway, here's the part of De Anima of the soul that I think applies best at this moment in Ulysses. It's from Aristotle's book 3, part 8, and I'm going to give a chunk of quote, not least to show the spread of Joyce's learning, as well as Aristotle's place in Joyce's conception of this chapter 3. Knowledge and sensation, says Aristotle. Now keep in mind, as I say, where Stephen is at this moment, by a rock on a beach, contemplating space and time, in a chapter about whether things don't exist until you see them. Excuse my intellectual crudeness and shorthand. Knowledge and sensation, said Aristotle, are divided to correspond with the realities. Potential knowledge and sensation answering to potentialities, actual knowledge and sensation to actualities. It is not the stone which is present in the soul, but its form. It follows that the soul is analogous to the hand, for as the hand is a tool of tools, so the mind is the form of forms, and sense the form of sensible things. Imagination, he said, is different from assertion and denial, for what is true or false involves a synthesis of concepts. In what will the primary concepts differ from images? Must we not say that neither these nor even our other concepts are images, though they necessarily involve them? And as you've gathered by the word sensible, Aristotle means of the senses, not commonsensical. And I think, I really do think in that part of De Anima that that's the core of chapter 3 here, and I think that's what Joyce was going after. And now Stephen deliciously introduces this idea of a shadow, which is not substance, as we know, but is form of my form. His shadow, as I say, is the form of his form. And he can shrink it anytime he likes, or expand it. It all depends on where he stands. Don't you love it? Next 3 sentences, and one of them is a complete stunner. Who watches me here, whoever anywhere, will read these written words, signs on a white field. He asks who watches him on a number of levels. Am I visible? Meaning, if I want to do something naughty here, can anyone see me and take offense? On another level, here I am writing, and does it mean a damn thing to anyone? Will it ever? Is the writer, the poet, totally alone? He ramps it up. Whoever anywhere will read these written words. A kind of despair, yes, closing time in the gardens of the West. And then comes the stunner, signs on a white field. He sees himself, you see, as he's writing, he sees that he's making words from letters, symbols, black ink on a white ground, birds against the sky, little flickers of symbols. And here we have the poet as the Roman augur, predicting the future of the world from the signs on the page. And then he switches. If it won't be read, it might be heard. If, Stephen thinks, you read it somewhere to someone in your flutiest voice. All kinds of stuff going on there, all kinds of stuff. And as I say, I'm really headlining as much as anything else. The next sentence ties a whole lot of things together, not just for here, but for the chapter, and indeed for one of the novel's core themes. One of the novel's core themes is the movements of people who will encounter one another. Here's a sentence. The good Bishop of Cloyne took the veil of the temple out of his shovel hat, a veil of space with coloured emblems hatched on its field. Now this sentence could be a podcast all on its own, and I did think about doing that. In fact, it could make several podcasts, because the good Bishop of Cloyne is the Irish philosopher George Berkeley, for whom Berkeley College in California is named. Berkeley. He pays your money, you take your choice. Berkeley's central tenet might be summed up as squaring his own circles. He was a bishop in the Church of Ireland, which is basically Anglican, that's to say Episcopalian. The Diocese of Cloyne is now, I think, in the Church of Ireland. The Diocese of Cork, Cloyne and Ross. That's in the south of Ireland. Indeed, I knew and interviewed 2 of its bishops, Dr. George Sims and Dr. Samuel Points, delightful men and wonderful company. Dr. Sims was an expert on the Book of Kells, and Bishop Berkeley, from his Diocese of Cloyne, vigorously defended his own beliefs in God and a divine unseen power, while at the same time saying that something doesn't exist until you see it, or more accurately perceive it. You see, that's what I mean about squaring his circles. On the one hand, he believed in God whom you can't see. On the other hand, he said, no, something doesn't exist until you see it. There's something wonderful about Berkeley. All reality to him was internal. The world is in one's head. It's a hugely enjoyable theory to play with, although it drove his contemporaries nuts. So let's look at that sentence again. The good Bishop of Cloyne took the veil of the temple out of his shovel hat. A Protestant bishop in those days wore a hat with a low crown, and the material was stiff, and the sides of the brim curled upward, so that you could, in theory, use it as a shovel. I've always known it as a shovel hat. And the veil of the temple, that's centrally about the miraculous happening at the moment Jesus Christ expired on the cross. And the veil of the temple in Jerusalem, I think, was split in two with not a hand to touch it. And not only that, no human hand could have split it anyway. It reached to about 80 feet in height and was made of heavy brocade fabric. So when Joyce says that the Bishop of Cloyne took the veil of the temple out of his shovel hat, he's saying two things. He's saying that the Holy of Holies, which the veil concealed, the most precious part of the temple, was now revealed. And at the same time, when Bishop Berkeley took off his hat, he was removing the veil of his own temple, i.e., the covering on his head. And just to finish this week, the other half of that sentence is veil of space with coloured emblems hatched on its field. It comes directly after the Bishop of Cloyne. Veil of space with coloured emblems hatched on its field. Where did we find the word field before? Because we're on the beach here. Think of heraldry. We've already had emblems from heraldry in this chapter, and a bishop has a coat of arms. Hatching, cross-hatching, is common in emblematic illustration. Now, how many times has Joyce used the word coloured in this chapter? Is it his fight back against theories of visibility? Things that are coloured are more easily seen? Stephen is looking at an open space, the wide strand, and on it are some cross-hatched marks. The distant, almost stick figures of the gypsy and his wife and their dog. And indeed Stephen himself is a mark on that landscape, as he has just been making marks on another wide clear space, a piece of writing paper. And that brings him to a contemplation of seeing and measuring space, and that's what we'll have next week. I know it's complex, but I am loving this. By the way, I used a quote earlier, not from Joyce, and I didn't expand on it. Apologies for that. I'll tell you what it is now. Do you remember I said something was closing time in the Gardens of the West? Well, it's from the English critic and man of letters Cyril Connolly, the man who said that the books he... This always makes me laugh because it's such a cop-out. He always said that the books he hadn't written were better than the books most people had written. And there's an escape hatch, eh? Anyway, the full quote is a lovely one, actually, was Connolly's observation about cultural decay. He said, "It is closing time in the Gardens of the West, and from now on an artist will be judged only by the resonance of his solitude or the quality of his despair." I love it. And he had a point. It didn't collapse, he said, and in any case, guys, it is not closing time here on Rejoice. I'll be back next week. Rejoice, episode 148, Sex and Stereoscopes. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. Last week we were in Time and Space. Stephen Dedalus in Chapter 3 of Ulysses on Sandymount Strand, no longer walking, now leaning against a rock, writing a snatch of a poem that he's been working on. It seems to be the poem about vampires and women and stuff, and he's also thinking about how he looks in that sunny morning scene, and who sees him there, and the gypsy woman down on the strand with her husband picking cockles, and bishops, and philosophy. Hey, it's a busy morning. He's a busy fellow. Here's the first piece of this week's text. Having compared the coloured marks that he and others constitute on the blank page that is the wide strand, very Joyce that, like emblems on a coat of arms, or, of course, really Joyce, words on a page, or birds in the sky, because he's been thinking about the Roman augurs and fortune-telling. He's just about to measure some distance, while he's afraid that what he writes will never be read by anyone, though he might read it to someone somewhere one day. Here we go. Bear with me. And I think we may get through a slightly longer piece this week. I know the last few weeks have been a sentence at a time or a phrase at a time. This week I think is longer. Here's the quotation. He's thinking, "Hold hard. Colored on a flat. Yes, that's right. Flat, I see. Then think distance, near, far, flat. I see. East, back. Ah, see now. Falls back suddenly, frozen in stereoscope. Click does the trick. You find my words dark? Darkness is in our souls, do you not think? Flute here. Our souls, shame wounded by our sins, cling to us yet more, a woman to her lover clinging, and the more, the more. She trusts me, her hand gentle, the long-lashed eyes. Now where the blue hell am I bringing her beyond the veil? Into the ineluctable modality of the ineluctable visuality? She. What she? You know, and when I think of it, this, Proteus, isn't even the most obscure chapter of Ulysses. However, here we go. Hold hard. Well, that's a catchphrase from writing, perhaps even more specifically hunting. It means when the master of the huntsman calls it out. It means stay, which is an order not to ride on, probably because the hounds have found they've put up a fox and the chase can begin. In another sense, it means stop that animal. And we'll soon see that it might just have a double entendre here. There's another beast that requires reining in, or will be holding when he's hard. And here now is a string of thoughts about place and distance and what he can see and what he can measure. Colored on a flat. It's a wide open beach. Yes, that's right. Flat, I see. Then think distance, near, far, flat, I see. East, back. Ah, see now. Stephen's surveying the strand. He agrees with his own definition of what he sees. Colored marks on a flat surface. Yes, that's right. And what follows can best be explained by the right inflection, which is yet another way in which Joyce is discussing here the difference between the written word and the spoken word. Listen. Listen to the inflections. Flat, I see. Or it could be flat, I see. Either works. Then think distance. Near, far, flat, I see. East, back. Ah, see now. And he describes himself and the view together as he falls back suddenly, frozen in stereoscope. Click does the trick. A stereo picture from those old machines could fold flat. I'm thinking out loud here. Click does the trick. Is that an early camera advertising slogan? You press the button, we do the rest. If it isn't an Eastman, it isn't a Kodak. As I've said before, I sadly don't have a copy of the Dublin newspapers for the 16th of June 1904, but I wonder whether an ad appears in which click or one click does the trick appears as a slogan, not only for a camera, but possibly for a vacuum cleaner as well, because Miele vacuum cleaners had one. I think it was Miele. Or maybe it was Hoover. One of the vacuum cleaner companies had one click does the trick, the click of the button. And you see, Ulysses, the novel, it's full of advertisements and their slogans. It might even be a slogan from an ad for a stereoscope, although I know that the ultimate stereoscope, the Viewmaster, didn't make its appearance until the 1950s. We had one in our house, sent to us by a friend of my father's, a lady from Boston. The stereoscope, I mean, it was there for a century before that. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great American lawyer, he even invented a version of the stereoscope. Holmes, by the way, was a terrifically interesting man. That fine actor Sam Elliott could play him. Looks just like him. Oops. Digression warning. Anyway, the stereoscope was hugely popular before Joyce was born and while he was alive. And it was a kind of 2 to 3 dimensional device where separate, almost the same pictures were loaded for each eye. And when both eyes took in the view, the scene was greatly enhanced. It was a scene painted onto a card. And here, Stephen attempts to translate the idea of space and distance into ineluctable visibility by thinking of the stereoscope. Ah, see now, falls back suddenly, frozen in stereoscope, click does the trick. Now you see, it's all putting together. His next thought takes him back not only to his poem, but to his idea that if nobody will read his poem, he will speak it one day in that flutiest voice he mentioned, which is a kind of mockery of precious verse reading with which Joyce was all too familiar from the drawing rooms of the day. He both addresses the person to whom he is reading, a woman we might think, with the words, "You find my words dark," and then continues, "Darkness is in our souls, do you not think?" He lies that into it, which might be in the poem or in his address to his imagined listener. And then comes the poem in fuller throat, or, as Stephen thinks, flutier, on the line, "Our souls, shame-wounded by our sins, cling to us yet more. A woman to her lover, clinging, the more the more." And now we can tell for sure, we the readers can tell for sure, what I touched on here a few weeks ago. Stephen is not writing an original poem. He's writing a version, almost a parody, of a 19th century poem called My Grief on the Sea, which goes, "My grief on the sea, how the waves of it roll, for they heave between me and the love of my soul. Abandoned, forsaken, to grief and to care, will the sea ever waken relief from despair?" And guess where he is? He's by the sea. The poet who wrote that was a well-known figure, almost a sacred cow, if you'll forgive the transgender bit. A man by the name of Douglas Hyde, who was a major part of the Irish revival tide. And there's a sense in which the poem, whatever about the introduction of vampires, is a kind of gently mocking homage to Hyde, or maybe it's satirical because vampires suck your blood, and Hyde was working off the old Irish traditions, languages, and folklore. And Joyce didn't, in general, have a great deal of time for the Irish revivalists. The poem is in a woman's voice, and it describes what Stephen thinks, a woman to her lover clinging, the more the more. And remember, he's also been watching a woman down on the shore. We're dealing here with one of the major parts of Ulysses, the end of chapter 3. We're not quite at the very end, that'll be a few weeks away. And we have to bear in mind that Joyce was only in his early 30s when he was writing what we've been looking at. And I wonder if he wasn't flexing muscle here a little, showing us his intellectual chops early. Be that as it may, the next passage is fairly straightforward. He moves from a verse reading into a randy fantasy. She trusts me, her hand gentle, the long-lashed eyes, and then arrests it with, "Now where the blue hell am I bringing her beyond the veil? Into the ineluctable modality of the ineluctable visuality. She, what she?" Well, it's easy to see what's going on here. First, there's a dab of purity with even a stab of conscience. The imagined woman, so far, is pure and innocent. She trusts me, her hand gentle, the long-lashed eyes. But then he questions himself as to what he's doing with this innocent woman. Now, where the blue hell am I bringing her beyond the veil? Interesting juxtaposition of words here, blue and hell. I've never come across blue hell as a slang euphemism. Blue blazes, yes, and of course blue is a synonym for lewd, as in blue jokes. But with the phrase beyond the veil, we get both the rending of the temple veil and the dance of the seven veils. And where is he moving this imagined woman? To where he can see her, into the ineluctable modality of the intellectual visuality. He wants to look at this woman with his imagination's eye. He wants to make her real. And now for a second or two, hark back to the poet reading verse to an imagined audience in a fluty voice, and we get the word shame-wounded, because even at that point, he's going to replace the ideal girl with the long eyelashes with something more real. The she. What she? The woman of his burgeoning, sexually excited thoughts. And I use the word burgeoning with some care and intent. More of the same next week, and we'll also have some exciting lingerie. You won't want to miss that, will you? Rejoice, episode 149, Touch and Go. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. By my reckoning, we have about 7 weeks left of chapter 3. Chapter 1, the Martello Tower, Buck Mulligan, Haynes the Englishman, all of that took 52 weeks. Exactly. And I didn't fix it like that. I didn't fix it for an exact year for chapter 1. I don't measure in advance. I try and figure out what I can get through. As you've seen, you'd be at liberty to say, well, how's that working for you? Chapter 2, Stephen teaching at Mr. Deasy's school. Joyce referred to the chapter but didn't title it as Nestor, after the mentor in Homer's Odyssey. That chapter took what? I think it was 32 weeks. And I began chapter 3, Proteus, on the 29th of February, 2012. 2012. So I'm heading for what, 15 months on this already? And it's a pretty short chapter, too, in the book. So what's ahead? Lord knows. I don't know. I'm just going to go on and do it a week at a time. What was it Samuel Beckett said? I can't go on, I'll go on. But as you may have gathered, I'm not exactly hating this. Okay. Episode 149. Stephen Dedalus is on Sandymount Strand at just about noon on Thursday, the 16th of June, 1904. He's been casting about in his mind for the best words for a poem he wants to write, inspired by the gypsy woman down there by the water, picking cockles with her husband. And the poem has also been brought to mind he's by the sea, remember, by a 19th century Irish poem by the cultural revivalist Dr. Douglas Hyde, which is about somebody on the sea. But his thoughts move on in the direction that another Irish writer, Brendan Behan, used to call carnival knowledge. Stephen is, to use the vernacular, randy. He's been imagining an ideal girl or woman with long eyelashes. And now he, so to speak, makes contact with her in his imagination. These first sentences, by the way, they're all in Stephen's head, a kind of raunchy yet poignant interior monologue. Here we go. The Virgin at Hodges Figus's window on Monday, looking in for one of the alphabet books you were going to write. Keen glance you gave her. This is Stephen thinking. Wrist through the braided jessie of her sunshade. She lives in Leeson Park with a grief and kickshaws, a lady of letters. Talk that to someone else, Stevie. A pick-me-up. Bet she wears those curse of God's stays, suspenders, and yellow stockings, darned with lumpy wool. Talk about apple dumplings. Piuttosto. Where are your wits? That's it. Well, here we get a glimpse of Stephen's erotic life in Dublin. Hodges Figus was his Dublin bookshop. Joyce did want to write a series of books, each based on the letters of the alphabet. Do you remember? Books you were going to write with letters for titles. Have you read his F? Oh, yes, but I prefer Q. Yes, but W is wonderful. 3 things of note here. It's Thursday, and Stephen saw her on Monday, a few days before Ulysses opens. Joyce's sense of continuum at work again. Secondly, wrist through the braided jessie of her sunshade was originally hand, not wrist, in Joyce's own writing. And thirdly, a treat, the word jessie. He uses it to describe the ribs of the sunshade because they look like a family tree, which is the original root of Jesse, taken from David, king of the Israelites. I've never seen the word Jesse used to depict the ribs of a sunshade or an umbrella. And there's a little something going on here. When you do see illustrations of the tree of Jesse, and I've seen some in Israel and in Spain, and I think I've seen one in Portugal, I'm not sure. In the illustration, in the picture, the tree comes up from a root in King David's prone body. It rises up from his abdomen, his torso, his crotch. And, blasphemy again, root is another Dublin slang word for penis. And Stephen is having root issues just now. And now we get the woman, a portrait of the woman he watched at the bookshop window. She lives in Leeson Park, he thinks, with a grief and kickshaws, a lady of letters. Talk that to someone else, Stevie. A pick-me-up. I bet she wears those curse of God stays, suspenders, and yellow stockings, darned with lumpy wool. Talk about apple dumplings, piuttosto. Where are your wits? He's still vacillating between ideal and actual. Leeson Park is a good Dublin address, by the way, not far from the city centre. Lady of Letters has, by my reckoning, an erotic charge for Stephen, a.k.a. Joyce. And as you'll see, as we go through the book, women of an upper class appeal to him too. She lives in Leeson Park with a grief and kickshaws, a lady of letters. Here he sets up a mystery, the mystery he needs. for his sexual fantasy. He's building a life in his head for this woman, this walking mystery with her sunshade. And she has a sadness about her. And kickshaws, I love this word, it comes from quelque chose, French, which can mean anything from an undefined something to a trinket, to a fancy French meal, or, as I've most often heard it, something small and tasty. Quelque chose, monsieur? They'll say as they place a little bonbon on the table with your coffee. Where are we? Yes. Next sentence. Yes. Talk that to someone else, Stevie. Pick me up. Well, at this segment of Ulysses, when Stephen is so contemplating himself and how he's changing in this chapter that's all about change, we're back and forth between Ulysses and back a few months to a portrait of the artist as a young man. And as you know, there's only 3 months between the end of the portrait and the beginning of Ulysses. And when you see the word Stevie, you know that you're hearing the voice of a student called Davin, a friend of Stephen's. Now, Davin, who is a minor character in a way in Ulysses, or in the portrait, well, he's not that minor. He says some important things. He was based on an interesting and significant man, George, or in Irish, Saoirse Clancy, the mayor of Limerick, who died at the hands of the notorious Black and Tans during the 19-teens troubles in Ireland. I think he died in 1921. In Portrait, Davin describes a pick-up encounter that he himself had out in the countryside between the borders of County Limerick and County Cork. And the way he tells it, I don't quite believe it. It's a fantasy. It's about stopping at a farmhouse and being invited in by the woman and so on and so forth. And now Stephen moves in on the woman in his fantasy, so to speak. He thinks, bet she wears those curse of God stays, suspenders and yellow stockings, darned with lumpy wool. Talk about apple dumplings. Pure tosto. Stays, suspenders, yellow stockings, darned yellow stockings. The quality the quality of this dame is tumbling, darned with lumpy wool. He calls them curse of God stays because they were like armor, and suspenders caused young men all kinds of fiddling trouble. But he's imagining her, and he's imagining her apple dumpling's bosom. And piuttosto, as Italian, means rather. Talk about apple dumplings. Rather. And now we have a pullback, so to speak, as Stephen's voice says to him, where are your wits? Because if he's about to do what he's about to do, down there in Sandymount Strand, there are people around who might see him, but he's in the grip of his fantasies. And here's the next short passage. Touch me. Soft eyes, soft, soft, soft hand. I am lonely here. Oh, touch me soon, now. What is that word known to all men? I am quiet here, alone, sad too. Touch me. He lay back at full stretch over the sharp rocks, cramming the scribbled note and pencil into a pocket, his hat tilted down on his eyes. 9 sentences there, some of them 2 words long at the beginning of that quote. They're self-explanatory, but watch this space. Apart from the touch me and the soft hand sentences, there's one beauty in there. You got it, I guess. Here it is again. What is that word known to all men? We'll find out later that it is, as you've guessed, the word love. Not, as some used to surmise about Joyce and Ulysses, the word death. And thereby hangs an interesting bauble, one of the many dangling baubles in Ulysses. I've heard it said that if a true version of the book could be produced, with all the corrections and mistypes and omissions and everything else fixed and everything in place exactly as Joyce wanted it, that the numerically central word of the 257,000 or 75,000, whatever, would be the word love. When I'm prepared to believe anything of that old genius Joyce, I think it's probably apocryphal, and that it got confused with this actual sentence, what is that word known to all men? And it was thereby turned into, what is the word at the center, at the heart of Ulysses? You can see how that would happen, can't you? The next sentence, the final sentence, is not Stephen's thought. It's an insertion of authorial narration and authority from Joyce. He lay back at full stretch over the sharp rocks, cramming the scribbled note and pencil into a pocket, his hat tilted down on his eyes. Well, we can see that scene clearly enough, and note that he gets a reference to words in there, scribbled. That's Joyce, always with the words. Okay, not bad this week as we're kind of coming round the last bend. Not into the home straight of Proteus yet, but we will be soon. And more of the same next week. Rejoice, episode 150, High Noon. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney, and we're at a tense moment, I suppose you'd call it, in Ulysses Chapter 3. Stephen, by a rock on Sandymount Strand, is lying back thinking of a woman and her underwear, and he has tilted his hat, his Hamlet hat, his cockle hat, his Latin Quarter hat, his Paris hat, down over his eyes as he lies back. Here's the text for this week. It's short. That is Kevin Egan's movement I made, nodding for his nap. Sabbath sleep. Et vidit Deus, et erant val de bona. Lo, bonjour. Welcome as the flowers in May. Under its leaf he watched through peacock-twittering lashes the southing sun. I am caught in this burning scene. Pan's hour, the faunal noon, among gum-heavy serpent plants, milk-oozing fruits, where on the tawny waters leaves lie wide. Pain is far. And no more turn aside and brood. End of the text, mostly in Stephen's thoughts. Lots of gems to be unearthed, polished and scrutinized here. Kevin Egan, you will remember, was the old Irish revolutionary bomb thrower that Stephen, while trying to become a medical student in Paris, met in the cafes there through his father's introduction. We had long passages some months back about Egan and absinthe and hollandaise sauce. So Stephen lies back and tips his hat in the manner of Kevin Egan. The model for Egan, by the way, was an Irish printer. Name of, was it Michael Casey? No, Joseph Casey. Joseph Casey, friend of Joyce's father, John Joyce, in real life. Next two sentences are in Latin. Et vidit Deus, et erant val de bona. Translations as follows, and now you'll pick up on the remark Sabbath sleep, which wasn't as simple as Kevin Egan taking a nap on a Sunday. It's all from the Bible. The book of Genesis. Et vidit Deus, and God saw, video videre, to see, et erant val de bona, and it was all good. We are talking about the creation here, and on the seventh day God rested. That's what's going through Stephen's mind as he lies back, and if you had had a boys' Catholic education in Ireland, you might be reaching for a biblical reference at that moment to offset other thoughts, to distract you from impure thoughts, carnal matters. By the way, the words, this is interesting, the words Sabbath sleep, they're not in Joyce's original draft manuscript. He must have added them at proof stage. Next sentences. Hello, bonjour. Welcome as the flowers in May. Actually, two exclamations and a sentence. You know, I looked very carefully at hello. It's H-L-O, capital H-L-O, and an exclamation point. Difficult to read because Joyce had added the words nodding for his nap just above the words movement I made and right beside hello, and they crash into the H of hello. And for a moment I thought it was A, not an H, hello, and I wondered whether he meant to write alors, which means onward, or here we are, or and the expression, well, hello there. No, it's hello, which is a truncated version of hello. Or hello, what's this we have here? And he doubles down. He follows it with bonjour, meaning hello in France, meaning good day, literally, which is a greeting. So who or what is he greeting? Who or what is welcome as the flowers in May? Well, first of all, that's a line from an old Irish emigrant ballad popular at the turn of the 20th century and made famous in the United States by a baritone called John W. Myers, who was probably the first big star of the record industry. Myers had hit after hit after hit. The Good Old Summertime, The Wearing of the Green, The Holy City, Jerusalem. He was Welsh by birth, and his voice was strong enough, they said. That's why he was successful. I love this, because His voice, I remember hearing this years and years ago about those early singers. I remember hearing this at the BBC. Their voices were strong enough to get over the noise on those first recordings, which were cylinders. And the song, Dear Old Donegal, which is where that comes from, the wearing of the green. No, the wearing of the green was a hit of his. Welcome as the flowers of May. That comes from Dear Old Donegal. Joyce must have known that song. I mean, he knew all the popular songs. Everybody's heard Dear Old Donegal. Shake hands with your Uncle Mike, me boy. And there's your sister Kate. Sure, she's the girl you used to swing down by the garden gate. Shake hands with all the neighbours and kiss the colleens all. And here's the line. You're as welcome as the flowers in May to Dear Old Donegal. Joyce definitely knew that. I can hear his father singing around the piano. I think Bing Crosby. No, I know Bing Crosby recorded it. Because isn't there a verse in it that goes Hannigan, Mannigan, Flanagan, Lanigan, whatever. Anyway, why is it used here? What's as welcome as the flowers of May? Well, something's happening, that's for sure. And good manners and etiquette doesn't allow us to dwell too closely on what's happening. So let me take this next stretch at a run. Under its leaf he watched through peacock twittering lashes the southing sun. The leaf, the brim of the hat, yes. And no, because he has forest thoughts here from a poem that we'll come to in a moment. And doesn't peacock twittering lashes the southing sun? Doesn't that feel like a quote from something or other? Typical Joyce, some obscure poem somewhere, some part of the Bible, whatever? Well, it's not a quote. It's a mimicry of that poet we'll come to in a moment. Stephen, therefore, lying on the rocks, is peering out at the world when he sees himself caught in this burning scene. And with the sun climbing toward noon, so is Stephen's solitary passion, and the physical response to it is climbing too. That's the part of his body that he's been saying bonjour to. When the line Pans are, the faunal noon, Faunal, the Greek god Pan is the Roman god Faunus, a satyr, synonymous with male lust and lechery. What was he doing, the great god Pan, down in the reeds by the river? Wrote Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Stephen then reaches for imagery to describe what his body is actually doing. And here's the imagery. Among gum-heavy serpent plants, milk-oozing fruits, where on the tawny waters leaves lie wide, pain is far. Let me take the last sentence first, because he's using it in a number of ways. In Greek pronunciation, the name of the god Pan is spelt with an extra I, pronounced pine, and it's like paeon or paisan, and it has to do with pasture. So Stephen is on the beach, and pain, i.e. pasture, is far away, not near. That's one dimension of that sentence. Now we get into stronger stuff. The mimicry. Here it comes. In the last quarter of the 19th century, one of the most powerful names in the city of Paris was that of a bilingual Frenchman named of Etienne Mallarmé, better known by the name he used, Stéphane Mallarmé. Now, Stéphane Mallarmé was a terrific poet. He was passionate, erotic, provocative, rich, stimulating, and I only know him in translation. And he has the reputation of not making it successfully into English. If that's unsuccessful, it might be worth mastering French totally. He inspired and influenced all kinds of people, and because he worked so much in images, composers were all drawn to him, the likes of Ravel and Debussy. And this is where the faun comes in. Debussy set a piece of Mallarmé's to music, and it later became a ballet, which I love, which I've seen at least 4 times, and which was staged by Nijinsky and Jerome Robbins. That Mallarmé piece was the poem L'après-midi d'un faune, Afternoon of the Faun, and Joyce admired Mallarmé. Listen. Here's the connection. Listen to it. This is from the poem. This is from Mallarmé's poem. The soul, void of words, and this heavy body succumb to noon's proud silence slowly. With no more ado, forgetting blasphemy, I must sleep lying on the thirsty sand. And as I, love, open my mouth to wine's true constellation, farewell to you both. I go to see the shadow you have become. Can't you hear the connections there? Earlier, we had phrases, the tawny hour in the poem. and the secret terrors of the flesh, and the swoon heavy and motionless. This is all an afternoon of a fawn, and I'll wake to the primal fever erect alone. And there are several more, but I'd be into overkill if I got them all. Read the poem, Afternoon of a Fawn, and again read this from Joyce. I am caught in this burning scene, Pan's hour, the faunal noon, among gum-heavy serpent plants, milk-oozing fruits, where on the tawny waters leaves lie wide, pain is far. That's, to put it bluntly, imagist mimicry. Mallarmé was an imagist poet. That's why he's so hard to translate. Joyce has his own images here. Enough said. Use your imagination. And then Joyce concludes the paragraph with a postclimactic phrase, a post-coitus homo tristis est note. It's a quote, and no more turn and brood. Well, this is from the W.B. Yeats poem stroke song, Who Goes with Fergus. Do you remember it cropped up in chapter 1? I think it was in a podcast called Fergus and Friends. And look around episode 19 or 20. Here's the quote again from the poem, which Yeats had in his play, The Countess Kathleen. And no more turn aside and brood upon love's bitter mystery. And there you have it. The gum-heavy, milk-oozing serpent plan has done its thing, and the Catholic young man sinks into a deeper depression. And I hate to tell you, but we'll have more of the same here next week. Join me then.